She came to Harlow with nothing but a worn suitcase, a 4-month-old letter, and the desperate hope that a man she'd never met still wanted a wife. The letter was folded so many times the creases had gone soft as cloth. She didn't need to read it anymore. She had the words memorized. I am not a man of great wealth, but I am steady, and I will build you something that lasts. Steady. She turned that word over in her mind every mile of the journey. Steady was more than most men had ever offered her. Steady might be enough. If you're watching this story, hit like and drop your city in the comments. I want to see how far this has traveled. The train let her off at a platform that was little more than weathered planks nailed together over bare dirt. There was no station house, just a hand-painted sign that read, Harlow, East 1879, the paint already peeling at the corners. Evelyn Hartwell stepped down from the rail car with her suitcase in one hand and her hat pressed against her head with the other, because the wind on the Nebraska plains didn't wait for you to get your bearings before it started pushing. She was 26 years old. She had a decent face, not a remarkable one, and hands that had already done more work than most people guessed when they looked at her. She'd been a seamstress in St. Louis, a cook's helper in Kansas City, a laundress for 14 months in a boarding house in Abilene, until the owner's son started coming around with ideas she had no interest in. She'd left Abilene with $40, a recommendation letter she'd never used, and the quiet certainty that drifting had to stop eventually, or it would just become her whole life. The letter from Gideon Pike had come through a matrimonial gazette she'd answered on a rainy Tuesday in October, when she was tired enough to try something she'd have laughed at a year before. His advertisement had been plain. Carpenter, 34, Harlow, NE, seeking a capable woman for frontier life. Not easy work, but honest. Right if serious. Most of the ads promised things: comfort, prosperity, a good Christian household. Gideon's ad hadn't promised anything except work and honesty. For some reason, that was what made her write back. She stood on the platform now and looked at the town. It was smaller than she'd imagined, though she wasn't sure what she'd imagined exactly. A main street of maybe 10 buildings, a general store, a livery, a saloon, with a broken shutter on its upper window that swung in the wind and banged and swung and banged, a land office, a church with no steeple yet, a smithy. A few houses pushed back from the main street toward the tree line, prairie in every direction beyond that, flat and enormous and indifferent. 2 men sitting outside the livery had stopped their conversation to watch her. A woman coming out of the general store with a wrapped parcel paused on the step. A boy of maybe 12 stood in the middle of the street with a bucket and stared at her openly, without any of the self-consciousness an adult would have managed. Evelyn picked up her suitcase and walked toward what she hoped was the general store, because she needed directions, and because standing still on the platform while people stared at her was not something she intended to tolerate for long. The woman with the parcel was still on the step when Evelyn reached her. She was perhaps 40, with a plain, weathered face and the kind of watchful eyes that came from years of assessing strangers quickly. "Excuse me," Evelyn said. I'm looking for a man named Gideon Pike, carpenter. I was told he works in this area." The woman looked at her suitcase, then back at her face. "You the mail-order bride?" Evelyn had known someone would say it like that sooner or later. She'd prepared for it. "I'm a woman who answered a matrimonial advertisement, if that's what you mean." "That's what I mean." The woman shifted her parcel. "Gideon's out at the Mercer homestead, about 1.5 miles east. He's been building the Mercer family a barn addition for 2 weeks now. Probably won't be back in town till evening." She paused. "You can wait at the Hallett house. Mrs. Hallett takes in travelers sometimes. I'll point you to it." "Thank you," Evelyn said. "I appreciate that." "Name's Clara Osgood," the woman said, not warmly, but not unkindly either. "My husband runs the land office. We know Gideon." She left a small pause on the word "no" that carried some weight Evelyn couldn't quite interpret yet. "He's a quiet man. Doesn't say much." "His letter was short," Evelyn said. Something shifted at the corner of Clara Osgood's mouth. Not quite a smile. "That sounds about right." Mrs. Hallett was a widow of 60-something who had opinions about everything and the time to share them all, which she did while Evelyn sat at her kitchen table with a cup of coffee that was too weak but appreciated. Her house smelled like dried herbs and old wood. 3 cats moved around the room with the slow authority of animals who knew they owned the place. Gideon Pike is a good man, Mrs. Hallett said, settling into the chair across from her. I want to be clear about that before I say anything else, because what I say next might not sound like a compliment. He is a good man who has no idea how to live with another person. He built his house out there on that claim mostly by himself, and he's been out there on that claim mostly by himself for 3 years, and men who do that get a particular way about them. What kind of way? Evelyn asked. Set, Mrs. Hallett said, like concrete that's had time to cure, not mean, just set in his rhythms. You'll need patience. I have patience, Evelyn said. Then, because she didn't want to oversell it, some. Mrs. Hallett looked at her for a moment with those sharp old eyes. Where are you from originally? Ohio, outside Columbus. Evelyn wrapped both hands around her coffee cup. I've been moving around for the last few years. Family? Mother passed when I was 16. Father remarried. His new wife and I didn't get along particularly well. She said it plainly, without self-pity, because it was just the shape of her history. I've been managing on my own since I was 18. So you're not fragile, Mrs. Hallett said, and it wasn't quite a question. No, Evelyn said. I'm not fragile. Good. The old woman nodded as though something had been settled, because that land out there doesn't have much patience for fragile. He came into town at 6:30, still covered in sawdust the way Clara Osgood had suggested he might be, and Evelyn saw him before he saw her because she'd been sitting on the bench outside Hallett's house for the better part of an hour, watching the road east. She'd wanted that, a moment to observe without being observed, to take the measure of him before he could take the measure of her. He was taller than she'd pictured from his letter, lean in the way men got from physical work, not from not eating. There was nothing hollow about him. His hair was dark and needed cutting, and there was sawdust in it. He was driving a wagon with a gray mare that looked tired, and he was looking at the mare with some concern, which told Evelyn something about him she filed away. A man who looks at a tired animal with concern is paying attention to things other than himself. He pulled up at the livery and climbed down from the wagon. One of the men sitting outside said something to him. Gideon turned and looked down the street toward Hallett's house, and then he saw her. He stood there for a moment, not moving. She stood up from the bench. The distance between them was maybe 30 yards, and the evening light was going orange across the prairie behind her, and she was aware of exactly how strange this was. Standing in a town she'd never been in, about to walk toward a man she'd exchanged 4 letters with over 3 months, who was, on paper, supposed to be her future husband. She walked toward him. He came a few steps to meet her and then stopped, like he wasn't sure of the etiquette either. Up close he had dark eyes and a face that had spent a lot of time in weather. Not old, but seasoned. There was a long, thin scar along his left jawline, faded to silver, old enough that it was just part of his face now. He was looking at her with an expression she couldn't read. Not unfriendly, not warm, careful maybe. Like a man trying to get something right that he didn't have a lot of practice getting right. Miss Hartwell, he said. His voice was lower than she'd expected and deliberate, like he thought about words before releasing them. Mr. Pike, she said, I would have written to say what train I was coming on, but I wasn't sure of the schedule until I bought the ticket. It's all right, he said. He looked at her suitcase, which she'd carried over from Hallett's and was holding at her side. That all you brought? That's all I have. He nodded slowly. He pushed his hat back and rubbed the heel of his hand against his forehead, leaving a faint smear of sawdust. I should tell you, the house isn't finished. Your letter said it was close. It's closer than it was 4 months ago. A pause. The kitchen's done, the main room, 2 of the 3 bedrooms. He said this carefully, like a man giving testimony. The 3rd bedroom still needs a floor, and the porch isn't on yet. All right, she said. He looked at her like he'd expected more of a response than that. It's not what I'd want to offer a woman coming all this way. Mr. Pike, Evelyn said, I've slept in a boarding house room with 4 other women, in a supply closet during a flood, and once in a very uncomfortable church pew in Missouri. An unfinished bedroom doesn't trouble me particularly. Something shifted in his face then, not quite a smile, but the possibility of one. The supply closet, he said. Long story, she said. I'd like to hear it sometime, he said. Then he seemed to realize he'd said something that implied a future in which she was still around to tell it, and the careful look came back. I don't want to. You should know that you're not obligated to stay if this isn't what you expected. You've come a long way. That's worth something regardless of what happens next. Evelyn looked at him steadily. I know I'm not obligated, she said. I don't do things I'm obligated to. I came because I chose to. What happens next depends on whether we can work together, and I think we need more than 5 minutes on a street to figure that out. He held her gaze. Whatever he was measuring, he seemed to find enough of it. That's fair, he said. Can we get supper somewhere? She asked. I've been on a train for 2 days and I haven't eaten since this morning. Orla's place does meals in the evening, he said. She's not fancy, but it's food. Food's enough, Evelyn said. Orla's place was a low building behind the saloon that served meals on mismatched tables with mismatched chairs lit by oil lamps that needed their wicks trimmed. A smell of beef stew and wood smoke filled the room. 3 other customers sat at separate tables. They all looked up when Evelyn and Gideon came in, and they all looked away a beat too slowly. Orla herself was a big-shouldered woman with red hands and an efficient manner who brought them stew and cornbread without asking what they wanted, because apparently there wasn't much choice in the matter. She set down Evelyn's bowl first, then Gideon's, then stood back and said to Evelyn, "You're the one from the paper." "The Matrimonial Gazette," Evelyn said. "Yes." Orla looked her over with frank assessment. "You look sensible enough," she said, which Evelyn understood was meant as a compliment. Then she went back to her kitchen. Gideon picked up his spoon and ate in silence for a moment. Evelyn did the same. The stew was good, better than she'd expected, and the cornbread was still warm, and she was hungry enough that she ate without speaking for a full 2 minutes. "Tell me about the Mercer barn," she said when she'd taken the edge off. He looked up from his bowl. "What do you want to know about it?" "You've been working it for 2 weeks. What's left?" "Loft framing, roof timbers after that." He set his spoon down. "Why?" "I want to know what your work looks like," she said. "What the days are like. You said in your letter that it's not easy work, and I believe you, but I want to understand what that actually means before I wake up tomorrow morning on a prairie homestead." He considered this. "Up before light," he said, "usually by 5. Horses need attention first. Then whatever the main job is, right now that's the Mercer barn, which means I'm off the property for most of the day. When I'm working on my own house, I'm there, but it's not easier. Material's heavy. Some of it I can't move alone, so jobs take longer than they should." He paused. "The nearest town with a real supply store is 3 hours by wagon. Mail comes twice a week if the roads are good. Winter closes some roads entirely. What do people do for neighbors?" she asked. "The Mercers are 2 miles east. Family named Brody is about the same distance north. There's a widow, Mrs. Colton, about a mile west. They're decent people." He looked at her. "It's quiet." "How quiet?" "Some days you don't hear a voice but your own." He said it plainly, like a man reporting weather. "I got used to it. Not everyone does." "I don't mind quiet," she said. "I mind purposelessness. Quiet with work I can handle." He was looking at her in that careful way again. "What do you know how to do?" he asked. "Your letters mention sewing, cooking. What else?" "I can do laundry, preserve food, manage a kitchen garden if there's time to plant one. I know basic animal care. Enough for chickens and a milk cow. I've done both before. I can mend tools if I know what they're supposed to do." She paused. "I'm a fast learner for things I haven't done. The house needs things I don't have time for," he said. "I've been so focused on the structure that the interior's rough. No curtains, no real storage. The kitchen's functional but not finished. There's work there if you're inclined to do it." "I'm inclined," she said. He looked at his cornbread, then back at her. "I want to say something, and I don't want you to take it wrong." "Say it," she said. "I've been on my own out there a long time," he said. "I'm not practiced at. I don't always know what to say to people. You might find me strange to live with. I'm telling you that ahead of time because I think you deserve to know it." Evelyn thought about this. "Are you unkind?" she asked. "No." "Are you the kind of man who thinks a woman's opinion isn't worth hearing?" A longer pause. "No," he said. "I'm not that kind." "Then I think we can work with strange," she said. "I'm a little strange myself." He looked at her, and this time the thing at the corner of his mouth went far enough to actually be a smile, small and brief and a little rusty from disuse, but there. "All right," he said. He took her to the homestead the next morning before the sun was fully up. She'd spent the night at Mrs. Hallett's, who had pressed a small wrapped parcel of cheese and dried apples on her for the road, in the way of people who express care through food. Gideon's wagon was at the front of Hallett's house at 5:15, the gray mare and a second bay horse already hitched and ready. The drive took nearly 40 minutes over Prairie Road that was not quite bad, but not quite good, through country that expanded in every direction in the early light, until Evelyn felt very small inside it. She had grown up in Ohio, which was flat enough, but Ohio had trees and fences and the sense of other people nearby. This was something else. A flatness so complete it felt less like land than like the idea of land. The sky above it was absurdly large. "Does it always look like this?" she asked. "Like what?" "Like the edge of the world." He glanced sideways at her. "Pretty much," he said. "You get used to it." "I don't know if I believe you," she said. "You don't have to," he said. "Give it a month." The house appeared first as a low shape on the horizon, growing as they approached into something she could distinguish as a structure, single story, wider than she'd expected, with the pale raw lumber of recent construction visible on one end where the work was still going on. There were tools under a lean-to on the south side. A well. A small outbuilding that was probably a storage shed. The bones of a kitchen garden, nothing planted yet, just the soil turned. He pulled the wagon up and set the brake and climbed down and went around to help her down, before she'd thought to do it herself. His hand was rough and dry and sure. She stood in front of the house and looked at it. It was unfinished, and she could see where the work had been done quickly versus where it had been done carefully, and she could see in the careful places that Gideon Pike was genuinely good at what he did. The corners were tight. The framing she could see on the unfinished section was even and solid. The roof line was straight. "You built this," she said. "Most of it," he said. "Hired 2 men from town to help with the roof timbers, but the rest of it, yes." "It's going to be a good house," she said. He looked at it the way people look at things they've spent a long time on. Something between pride and exhaustion and the particular gravity of something that matters. "That's the idea," he said. She picked up her suitcase and walked toward the door. The interior was exactly what he'd described, which she appreciated. No attempt to make it sound better than it was. No reassurances that turned out to be lies. Just an accurate accounting of what she'd find. The main room was large, with a stone fireplace along the east wall and 2 south-facing windows that let in good light. The kitchen had a proper iron range that looked new and a work table and shelves, functional but bare. The 2 finished bedrooms were plain, bare floors, bare walls, nothing decorative, but solid and clean. The 3rd bedroom at the back of the house had walls but no floor yet, just the joists exposed, and you could see the ground beneath them. Gideon had laid 2 wide planks across the joists as a temporary bridge to the far wall where a window had been framed but not yet glazed. "I'll get to the floor this week," he said from the doorway, "before I go back to the Mercer job." "What's the window situation?" she asked. "Glass is ordered. Should come in on next week's supply wagon from Kearney." She turned around in the doorway of the unfinished bedroom, assessing. "I'll take one of the finished ones for now," she said. "Obviously. You can take whichever one you want," he said. There was a slight awkwardness in the air around that, the reality of 2 unmarried people in a house together, something neither of them had addressed directly. The letter exchange had discussed the arrangement in terms of practicality and intention, but not in terms of the specific daily reality of shared space. "Mr. Pike?" she said. "Gideon?" he said. "If we're going to be living in the same house, I'd rather you used my name." "Gideon," she said, "I think we both know that the arrangement we discussed requires time. Getting to know each other, deciding if this is workable. I'm not assuming anything, and I don't think you are either." He met her eyes. "No," he said, "I'm not. So we're agreed on that." She looked back at the house. "I'll take the east bedroom. I'd like to get settled, and then I'd like you to show me everything. The root cellar, the outbuildings, the water situation, what stores you have. So I know what I'm working with." He nodded. "After breakfast," he said. "I'll make breakfast." "You cook?" "I've been feeding myself for 3 years," he said. "I manage." She raised an eyebrow. "Manage how well?" "Well enough," he said, and there was a dry note in it that she was starting to recognize as the closest he got to humor. "Ina." He made eggs and fried salt pork and coffee, and it was plain and it was good, and they ate at the kitchen table without much talking, but not with the strained silence of strangers. Something more like the quiet of two people who were both observing and processing, working out where they stood. She noticed he drank his coffee black, and that he ate without rushing. She noticed he cut the salt pork into even pieces before he ate it, which she had no explanation for but filed away as detail. He noticed her looking around the kitchen while she ate, at the shelves, at the stores, taking inventory. He didn't comment on it. After breakfast, he showed her the root cellar, which was deep and well constructed and had enough dried and salted food to last a winter if they were careful, plus good empty shelving for what she could put up from a summer garden. He showed her the outbuilding, which held tools and materials, lumber stacked carefully under oilcloth, nails in jars sorted by size in a way that told her he was a man with a system for things. He showed her the well and the water barrel and the path to the creek that ran about a quarter-mile south. He had 2 horses, the gray mare whose name was Agnes and the bay whose name was Hal, and 4 chickens he'd gotten from the Brody family and clearly had not bonded with. "They're for eggs," he said, watching them with the detachment of a man who had no interest in naming them. "Have they been laying?" she asked. "Inconsistently," he said. She looked at the coop, which was functional but dark and not particularly well ventilated. "I can fix that," she said. He looked at the coop. "The chickens don't seem to require—" "Chickens lay better with good light and air," she said. "I'll look at it tomorrow." He was quiet for a moment. "All right," he said. They walked back toward the house through the morning light, which had gone from pale gold to full white now, and was falling across the unfinished lumber of the house's east wall in a way that showed both the work done and the work remaining. A pair of meadowlarks were doing something complicated in the sky to the south. The wind had dropped from the night before. "It's going to be a cold winter," he said, not to her particularly, just said it. "They always are out here?" "Usually," he said. "This one I think will be bad, the way the summer's gone." She looked at the wall of the house, at the fresh lumber, the careful joints. "Then you should finish it before it hits," she said. He glanced at her. "I can help," she said, "with whatever I can do. I'm not claiming I know carpentry. I don't. But I'm capable of handing tools, holding boards, doing whatever helps you move faster. I've got 2 hands that work." He stopped walking. She stopped too. They were standing in the yard with the house in front of them and the prairie behind them and the sky overhead being enormous and indifferent, and he was looking at her with that careful expression. "You came here to keep house," he said. It wasn't quite a statement, more like a man checking his understanding of the situation. "I came here to build a life," she said. "I don't know yet what that means, but I know that the house you're building is part of it, and I'd rather be useful than wait inside for it to be finished." He was quiet for a moment. The meadowlarks had gone. "I'll think about it," he said, which was not no. And out here, she was beginning to understand, not no from Gideon Pike was worth paying attention to. That first week was about finding a rhythm, and it was harder than she'd expected, not because of the work, which she was used to, but because of the particular challenge of sharing space with someone whose habits were so thoroughly established that she felt like a new piece of furniture placed in a room that had already been arranged to someone else's satisfaction. He woke at 5 without an alarm and started the morning fire without making noise, and she could hear him moving through the house with the quiet confidence of a man who knew every board and where it creaked and moved around it automatically. She adapted. She started waking at 5 herself, not because she had to, but because she didn't want to be the person still in bed when the day started. She took over the cooking after the second morning, not because his was bad, but because she was better at it, and they both knew it, and she saw no reason not to apply the skill. He accepted this transition without comment, which she took as its own kind of acknowledgement. She fixed the chicken coop on the 3rd day, cutting a new ventilation panel into the south wall with a saw she found in the outbuilding. She'd never used a handsaw before on anything more serious than a piece of rope. The cut was not straight, and she had to redo it. The second cut was better. She patched the gap with a wooden frame and hardware cloth from a roll she found in the shed, and when she was done, the coop had proper ventilation and better light, and she had 3 blisters on her right hand and sawdust in her hair. Gideon came back from the Mercer job that evening, unhitched the horses, and came around the back of the house and stopped when he saw the coop. He was quiet for a moment. He walked over to it and examined her work, looked at the frame, tested the hardware cloth, looked at the cut. "Second cut's better than the first," he said. "I noticed that too," she said. He turned around. She was standing there with her blister hand tucked against her side, and sawdust probably still in her hair and not willing to show either as a problem. "2 eggs today," she said. "Up from nothing." He looked at the coop again. He said. Which from Gideon Pike she was beginning to understand was a sound that could mean several things, and in this case meant something like well done expressed in the most economical way possible. She went inside to finish supper. He followed shortly after, washed his hands at the kitchen basin, and sat down at the table. She brought him coffee before the food was ready, the way she'd noticed he liked, and he wrapped both hands around the cup and looked at the table and said nothing for a moment. Then he said, "The Mercer job is almost done. After that, I'll be back here full-time to finish the house." "Good," she said. "I could use a second pair of hands for the porch work." He set it to the table, not quite to her. "If you're still interested," she set down the pot she was holding. "I'm still interested," she said. He looked up then. "It's hard work," he said, "and it'll be cold by then. I don't want you to, Gideon," she said. "I fixed the chicken coop." "You did," he said. "The porch won't fix itself," she said. He held her gaze for a moment. Then that small, rusty, briefly there thing happened at the corner of his mouth again. "No," he said, "it won't." Outside, the wind was picking up from the north, the first real edge of autumn in it, a reminder of what was coming, of the cold that would arrive without ceremony and stay as long as it wanted. The prairie would not wait for them to be ready. It never did. But the house was real, and the work was real, and there was a woman at the stove and a man at the table and 2 eggs from a repaired chicken coop. And in Harlow, Nebraska in the fall of 1882, those were not small things. The eggs became 4 by the end of the second week. Evelyn didn't mention it to Gideon, but he noticed. He noticed most things she was learning, he just didn't always say so. And one morning she came into the kitchen to find he'd already collected them and left them in the bowl on the work table without comment. It was the kind of small acknowledgement she was getting used to from him. Not words, just evidence that he'd paid attention. The Mercer job finished on a Thursday. He came home earlier than usual, the wagon lighter without the tools he'd left at the Mercer place until the final work was done. And she could tell from the way he moved, a little slower, a little less wound up, that the job was genuinely behind him now. He unhitched Agnes and Hal, gave them both water and feed, and then stood outside the barn for a few minutes in the cooling air, doing nothing in particular, which she understood was him decompressing in the only way he knew how. She didn't go out to him. She finished what she was doing in the kitchen and let him have the quiet. When he came inside, he washed up and sat at the table, and she poured him coffee, and he said, "Mercer's done," and she said, "I know," and that was enough. Over supper, he told her what the next 2 weeks needed to look like. The porch framing first, because the porch would give the house weather protection on the north side, and they needed that before the temperature dropped further. After that, the 3rd bedroom floor. Then the window glazing when the glass arrived. Then smaller things, dozens of them. The kind of finishing work that didn't look like much from outside but determined whether a house felt lived in or just built. He laid it out methodically, not asking her opinion exactly, more like thinking out loud at a person who was listening, which was its own kind of inclusion. She asked questions where she had them. He answered them directly, without the slight impatience some men showed when a woman asked about the practical mechanics of something. "The porch posts," she said. "How heavy are they?" "Heavy enough that setting them alone takes twice as long as it should," he said. "I've been doing it that way for 2 years. The porch is the last thing I keep putting off." "Then we start with the porch," she said. He looked at her across the table. "You still want to help with that?" I said I did. "It'll be cold mornings," he said. "I have a coat," she said. He was quiet for a moment, in the way he got quiet when he was making a decision he wasn't going to make out loud. Then he pushed back from the table and said, "All right, tomorrow morning I'll show you what we're working with." That was how it started. Not with ceremony, not with any particular moment of significance. Just 2 people at a kitchen table in a half-finished house deciding to work together. He was a patient teacher, which surprised her. She'd half-expected impatience. She was a stranger to this kind of work, and she knew it showed. knew that her inexperience would slow things down before it sped them up. But Gideon showed her the way he showed her everything, plainly, without decoration, with the assumption that she was capable of understanding if he explained it clearly. He showed her how to read the grain of lumber before cutting, how a board that looked straight could twist in the cut if you didn't account for the grain's direction. He showed her how to hold the post while he set the base bolt, and then how to check the level, and then how to hold a level herself while he moved to the next position. Her hands were a problem at first. Not weak, she'd never had weak hands, but untrained for this specific kind of grip. And after the first full day of porch work, her palms were raw in new places, and the blisters from the chicken coop had torn and healed wrong. She dealt with it in the evenings with the lard and clean cloth she kept in the kitchen, and she didn't mention it, and he didn't ask, and she suspected he knew anyway. "You're gripping the mallet too hard," he said on the third day, watching her drive a temporary brace stake into the ground. "I know," she said without stopping. "Ease off. Let the weight of the head do the work." She adjusted. The next strike was cleaner, and she felt the difference. Less fighting the tool, more using it. She glanced at him. "Better," he said. She went back to work. The cold came in faster than she'd hoped. By the third week of October, the mornings had teeth, and working outside meant numb fingers by 8 o'clock, and a particular misery in the knuckles that she found she could push through if she kept moving. Gideon never acknowledged the cold in any particular way. He just dressed for it and worked in it and expected the same of himself that he always expected, which she supposed was its own kind of standard. The porch frame took 6 days. It was the longest 6 days she'd spent in years, and also, in a way she couldn't quite explain to herself, among the most satisfying. By the fourth day, she could see the structure taking shape, the posts true and level, the header beams solid, the whole thing beginning to look like a real porch, and not just raw material. On the fifth day, she noticed Gideon had stopped checking her work every time he passed it, and had started just moving on, which was its own form of acknowledgement. On the sixth day, when they set the last header beam, and it dropped into its brackets exactly as it was supposed to. Not wrestling with it, not close enough, but not quite right, just exactly right on the first try. Gideon looked at it for a moment and said, "Good," and Evelyn felt something in her chest that she didn't have a name for. The town had opinions. She'd known it would. Clara Osgood came out to the homestead on a Tuesday with a jar of preserved plums and the real agenda of seeing what was happening. She was pleasant about it, and Evelyn was pleasant back, and they had coffee at the kitchen table while Gideon worked outside, and Clara looked around at what Evelyn had done with the interior. The curtains she'd sewn from muslin she'd bought in town, the storage she'd organized, the general livability of a space that 3 weeks ago had been bare, and said, "You've made a real difference in here." "It needed work," Evelyn said. "He's not a domestic man," Clara said, which was not unkind. "His mind is on the structure. The inside things he just leaves." "I don't mind that," Evelyn said. "We each have what we're good at." Clara turned her coffee cup in her hands. "People in town are talking," she said, "about you working outside with him. On the construction." "I figured they would be," Evelyn said. "Some of them think it's not proper exactly. A woman doing that kind of work." Evelyn looked at her steadily. "What do you think?" Clara was quiet for a moment. "I think," she said slowly, "that frontier life doesn't have much room for deciding what work is appropriate for who. My mother built fence lines when my father was sick. Her mother drove a plow. We tell ourselves stories about what women should be doing, but what women have always actually been doing is whatever needed doing." "That's exactly right," Evelyn said. "Don't tell the widow Pierce I said so," Clara said. "She'd have opinions." Outside they could hear Gideon working, the steady rhythm of the mallet, the occasional scrape of wood on wood, the sounds of a man who is always doing something rather than not. "Can I ask you something personal?" Clara said. "You can ask," Evelyn said. The two of you." She paused, seemed to decide the direct route was the only one. "Are you happy here? Really?" Evelyn thought about it, which was itself an answer of a kind. She didn't say of course or yes, wonderfully the way a woman performing contentment would. She actually thought about it. "I don't know yet what this is," she said finally. "Me and Gideon. I think we're figuring it out. But I'm not unhappy, and I don't feel out of place the way I thought I might." Out of place how? Clara asked. I've been moving around for years, Evelyn said. I got used to feeling like a temporary person, like I was just passing through whatever situation I was in. She looked at her coffee. This is the first place in a long time where I feel like I'm actually building something, not just waiting to leave. Clara was quiet for a moment. Then she said, Gideon has been out here alone for 3 years. He's not a man who shows much of what he's thinking, but I've known him since he came to Harlow, and I've never once seen him let someone help him work on his house before you. Evelyn looked up. Just something to keep in mind, Clara said, and finished her coffee. What Clara said stayed with her. She turned it over in the evenings when she was sewing by the fire or lying awake listening to the wind batter the north side of the house. Gideon was not an easy person to know. He was not unfriendly and not cold, exactly. He was more like a man who had spent a long time reducing his own needs down to the practical minimum, who had trimmed away anything that required another person until he was a very self-sufficient, very efficient, very lonely machine. She could see the loneliness in him the way you could see a crack in timber that had dried too fast, not obvious from a distance, just part of the surface until you were close enough to see where it ran. She was not sure what to do with that. She had her own cracks. She wasn't going to pretend otherwise. The third bedroom floor happened in the second week of November, and it was the job that changed something between them, though she couldn't have said exactly why. It was interior work, which meant it was warm, which meant they were working in close proximity in a small space, and she was learning by then to anticipate what he needed, handing the right tool before he asked for it, holding the piece while he secured it, adjusting her position to stay out of his way, and in the right place simultaneously. They'd developed a kind of unspoken physical grammar on the porch job, a way of moving around each other without collision, and it worked inside too, better than she'd expected. He was laying the floorboards tongue in groove, which required precision, and he was particular about it in a way she now understood was not perfectionism exactly, but pride in the specific, the belief that a thing worth building was worth building right. She was helping him pull the boards tight before he drove the nails, using a rubber mallet against a scrap piece to close any gaps. Tighter, he said. She put more weight into it. The board shifted another fraction. Good. Hold it. She held. He drove 3 nails in quick succession with the confidence of a man who'd done it 10,000 times. Not careless, just fluent. Then he moved to the next board, and they reset. They worked this way for the better part of 3 hours, and the floor grew, and in the middle of it, without looking up from what he was doing, he said, "You're not what I expected." She kept her grip on the mallet. "What did you expect?" He was quiet for a moment, driving another nail. Then, "Someone more cautious. Most people, when they come somewhere new, they're careful for a long time. They watch and wait." "I watch," she said. "You watch, and then you do," he said. "It's different." He moved the next board into position. "Most women who come out here through those advertisements. I heard about another one, family over in Crane County. She lasted 2 months, said it was too hard." "Maybe it was too hard for her," Evelyn said. "Maybe," he said. "Or maybe she'd expected something different." "What did you expect?" she asked again. "Really?" He thought about it, sitting back on his heels for a moment, looking at the half-finished floor. "I expected to be disappointed," he said. "Not by you specifically, just in general. I have a tendency to expect things won't work out." She looked at him. He was still looking at the floor. "That's a hard way to live," she said. "It's a practical way," he said. "If you don't expect much, you don't lose much." "You also don't get much," she said. He turned and looked at her then. She held his gaze without adjusting it. Not combative, just honest. There was a long moment where neither of them said anything, and the wind pushed against the new glass in the window she'd helped him install the week before. And somewhere in the house, the fire settled in the fireplace with a soft thump. "That's probably also true," he said, and went back to work. The glass for all the windows came in on a Wednesday, 3 weeks later than expected, because the supply wagon had been delayed by washed-out road, and Gideon had been managing without a word of complaint. He was not a man who complained about things he couldn't change. But she could tell from the way he checked toward town every time she sent him in for supplies that the windows mattered to him more than he let on. A house without glazed windows was a house that leaked cold at every opening. It was the difference between functional and finished was what he was working toward. They glazed the windows over 2 days, and it was fussy work that required patience. Evelyn had never cut glass and didn't try. That part she watched carefully and handed tools and held things, which she had gotten very good at. But the glazing compound, the cleaning, the careful seating of each pane, that she could do and did. When they set the last pane in the kitchen window and the evening light came through it clean and gold and unbroken by wind, Gideon ran his thumb along the edge to check the seal and said nothing for a moment. "Level," he said finally. "Yes," she said. "Good light in here," he said. "It's a good kitchen," she said. He turned away to clean the tool, and she thought she was the only one who saw it, the way he looked at the window for just a second more before he turned. The thing in his face that wasn't quite satisfaction but was adjacent to it. Something that looked like a man seeing something become what he'd meant for it to be. The days shortened. November turned the color of old iron. The sky went gray and stayed gray, and the wind found new angles to come at the house from, testing the porch frame she'd helped build, testing the new caulking around the windows. The house held. She noticed when it held the same way she imagined he did, with a quiet vindication, the particular pleasure of something built well meeting the conditions it was built for. They fell into a pattern that was not a routine exactly, but a rhythm. The difference being that a routine was mechanical and a rhythm had feeling in it. She cooked. He did the morning chores. They worked on the house through the cold afternoon hours until the light went. In the evenings he read. He had a small shelf of books that surprised her. 2 of them engineering texts, but also a collection of essays and a novel he'd read so many times the spine had given up. And she sewed or wrote letters or sat near the fire with her own thoughts. They talked more than she'd expected. Not constantly, not like people who filled silence because they were afraid of it, but genuinely, about the house, about the work, about Harlow and its people, and the larger politics of land and settlement that were rewriting the plains in real time. He knew about those things. He read newspapers from Kearney when he could get them, and he had opinions he expressed carefully and without heat, which was rarer than it should have been in her experience. She told him about St. Louis, about Kansas City, about Abilene, and why she'd left. She didn't dress it up or make it more dramatic than it was. He listened the way he always listened, completely, without his attention wandering, without the habit some people had of thinking about what they were going to say next, rather than actually hearing what you were saying. "Were you ever scared?" he asked, "about leaving Abilene, about the road?" She thought about it honestly. "Sometimes," she said. "Mostly I was just determined. Scared and determined at the same time." "That's most of courage," he said. She looked at him. He was looking at his book, or looking in the direction of his book. "Is that something someone told you?" she asked. "My father," he said. "He wasn't a brilliant man, but he was occasionally right." "Where is he now?" "Gone," he said. 8 years. "I'm sorry," she said. "He got to see me start the trade," Gideon said. "He thought it was a good idea. He was practical about things." A pause. "My mother thought I should stay in Ohio and work in her brother's dry goods store. She never entirely forgave me for coming out here." "Does she write?" Evelyn asked. "At Christmas," he said. "Short letters. Mostly news about people I barely remember." He turned a page. "She'll write about you when I tell her." It was the first time he'd mentioned telling his family about her. The casualness of it, the assumption she'd still be there, that she was a fact worth conveying, sat somewhere in her chest and stayed there. She said, "What will you tell her?" He thought about it with the deliberateness he brought to most things. "That you fixed my chicken coop," he said, "and that you helped me build the porch." "That's what you'll lead with?" she said. "She'll understand what it means," he said, and there was something in the dry quietness of it that made her look away before he could see whatever her face was doing. The floor in the 3rd bedroom dried. She moved her things from the east bedroom, her suitcase, the small mirror she'd bought in town, the 3 books she'd carried from Abilene, and set up properly in the room she'd helped build the floor for. She stood in it in the late afternoon light with the new floorboards pale and clean under her feet and the window she'd helped glaze looking out over the South Prairie, and she felt something she hadn't felt in a long time. Not happiness exactly. Or not only happiness, something more foundational than that. Something like arrival. She heard Gideon in the main room, moving around the way he did in the evenings, not restlessly but purposefully, always with some small task or maintenance. She heard him stop near the hall. "Room working out?" he called. "Yes," she called back. A pause. "I'll get to the trim around the window this week. It's still rough." "It's fine," she said. "It's not finished," he said, which was his answer to "it's fine" on anything to do with the house. Unfinished was not a category he accepted easily. She almost smiled at the wall. "All right," she said. "The trim then." Outside the prairie went on in the gray November light, as flat and enormous and indifferent as it had been the morning she arrived. But standing in that room she'd helped make, in the house she'd helped finish, it didn't feel like the edge of the world anymore. It felt like the start of something she didn't have a name for yet, but was becoming less afraid of by the day. The trim around the third bedroom window took him 4 days longer than he'd said it would, because he tore it out twice before he was satisfied with the mitered corners. She watched him do it the second time, pull out perfectly acceptable work with a flat bar, careful not to split the wood, stacking the pieces to one side. And she almost said something and then didn't, because she recognized the look on his face. It was not frustration with the work. It was the face of a man who had a standard in his head and was not willing to settle below it just because settling would be easier. She understood that. She had the same thing in her, differently shaped. The corners, when he finally got them the way he wanted, were tight and clean and fit together at the angle like they'd grown that way. She ran her thumb along the joint the way she'd seen him do it, checking by feel. "That's good," she said. "It's what it should have been the first time," he said. "You got it right," she said. "That's what matters." He looked at her briefly, then back at the trim. "You're more patient with my perfectionism than I am," he said. "I don't think it's perfectionism," she said. "I think you just know what good looks like." He was quiet for a moment, then, "That's a generous way to put it." "It's an accurate way," she said, and left him to it. December arrived with a seriousness that the previous weeks had only suggested. The first real snow came on a Thursday morning, and Evelyn stood at the kitchen window with her coffee and watched it fall. Straight down, no wind yet, in large soft flakes that covered the ground with a speed that was almost alarming. By noon there were 8 inches on the flat. By evening there were 14, and the wind had found its footing and was driving the snow sideways against the north face of the house with a sound like sand thrown against glass. The porch held. She noticed this and was glad. Gideon brought the horses into the larger outbuilding he'd reinforced 2 weeks ago, specifically for this. She'd helped him hang the new door hardware, had held the door while he set the hinge pins, and he came in from outside with snow on his hat and his shoulders and went straight to the stove to warm his hands. She handed him coffee without being asked, and he took it without saying thank you, which was not rudeness, but efficiency, the kind of communication 2 people develop when they've spent enough time in the same space. "How bad?" she asked. "Bad enough," he said. "We're in for a few days at least. Mercer's probably snowed in too." She turned back to the stove. She had a pot of salt pork and beans going, which she'd started before the snow worsened because she'd grown up in enough cold winters to know that a storm day was a day to have food ready and not be thinking about it later. "The wood supply?" she asked. 3 weeks if we're careful," he said. "More if the temperature comes up." "It won't come up," she said. "No," he agreed. "Probably not." They ate early, while it was still light, the snow so thick at the windows that the usual long prairie dusk had been replaced by a flat gray that faded directly to dark. The wind made the house talk, small sounds in the eaves, a particular whistle through a gap she hadn't identified yet. And Gideon sat with his head slightly tilted sometimes, listening the way a man does when he's cataloging problems for later. "There's a gap somewhere in the north gable," he said. "I hear it," she said. "I'll find it when the weather breaks." "I can help you look," she said. He looked at her. By now that look, the one where he was deciding whether to say the thing he was thinking, was familiar enough that she could see it coming. "You don't have to keep volunteering for every uncomfortable job," he said. "I'm not volunteering for the uncomfortable part," she said. "I'm volunteering because 2 people find a gap faster than 1. He was quiet for a moment. "That's true," he said. The storm lasted 4 days. By the second day, they had finished the immediate list of house repairs and maintenance and were left with the strange enforced intimacy of being 2 people who could not easily go anywhere else. She read. He worked at the kitchen table on drawings, plans, she realized, looking from across the room, rough elevations and floor plans for what she eventually understood were other buildings, future jobs, or the ideas of them. "You're drawing houses," she said on the third evening. "A livery, actually," he said, without looking up. "Harlow needs a proper one. Reardon's place is half rotted." "Has he asked you about it?" "Not yet," Gideon said. "But he will. His roof's not going to make another winter." He turned the paper slightly, looked at something in the elevation. "I like to have the idea worked out before someone asks. So when they ask, I can tell them what it would cost and how long." "Do you enjoy it?" she asked. "The planning part." He looked up then. "What do you mean?" "I mean, do you like the drawing, the figuring out, or is it just practical, getting ready for the work?" He thought about this more carefully than she'd expected him to, which told her it was a question no one had asked him before. "Both," he said finally. "The planning it's the part where the thing still might be perfect, where you haven't made any mistakes yet. The actual building is better because it's real, but the planning has its own thing. Like holding a possibility," she said. He looked at her. "Yes," he said. "Like that." She went back to her book. He went back to his drawing. The storm pushed at the house, and the house pushed back, and inside the lamp on the kitchen table threw a circle of yellow light across his hands, moving over the paper. And it was, she thought, the most settled she had felt in a very long time. It was on the fourth day of the storm, with the wind finally dropping, that she made her mistake. She had gone to the outbuilding to check on the horses. Gideon was dealing with a roof leak over the storage room that had declared itself that morning. And on the way back, she crossed a patch of ground where the snow had crusted over a sheet of ice beneath, and her left foot went out, and she went down hard on her right knee and both palms. She sat in the snow for a moment, taking stock. The palms were scraped raw through her gloves. The knee was bad, not broken, she was fairly certain, but badly hit. And when she stood, it made a decision about bearing weight that it immediately reversed. She hobbled back to the house and sat down at the kitchen table and was pulling off her glove to look at her palm when Gideon came in from the storage room. He stopped when he saw her. "What happened?" "Ice under the snow," she said, "near the outbuilding. I went down." He crossed the room and pulled a chair around in front of her and sat. "Let me see," he said. She held out her palm. He looked at it without touching it first, the way she'd noticed he always looked at problems before putting his hands on them. Then he turned her hand slightly to see the extent of the scrape. "The other one," he said. She showed him. He looked. Then, "Your knee?" "Sore," she said. "I don't think it's anything serious." "Can you straighten it?" She straightened it slowly. It hurt, but it moved correctly. "Yes." "Bend it." She bent it. Same answer. He watched the movement, not her face, focused on the mechanics. "It'll swell tonight," he said. "Probably hurt more tomorrow than today." "I've had worse," she said. "That's not really the point," he said. He got up and brought the tin of lard salve from the kitchen shelf, which they'd been sharing since her blisters in October, and the clean cloth she kept there. He sat back down and, without asking, began cleaning her right palm with the cloth, which was wet and cold, and she drew a breath sharply. "Sorry," he said, and slowed down. He was careful. That was the word for it. The same carefulness he brought to the trim and the floorboards and the window glazing applied to this, to her hands, to the scrapes in her palm. She watched him work and felt something odd in her throat. "Gideon," she said. "Thank you," she said, "for this." He looked up briefly. "You work with your hands," he said. "You need them to work." "That's not the only reason people take care of each other," she said. He held her gaze for a moment. Then he went back to the salve and the cloth and said nothing more. But the carefulness didn't change, and she decided that was its own answer. The storm broke on the fifth morning. Evelyn's knee was sore and stiff for 3 days, bad enough that she favored it obviously on the second day, and Gideon simply moved the things she usually retrieved from lower shelves to counter height without comment, which made her want to both thank him and argue with him. So she did neither and just used the things where he'd put them. It was the middle of December now, and the house was very nearly done. The porch was finished, the floors were finished, the windows were glazed, the trim was right. What remained were small things. The last of the interior shelving, a repair to the root cellar door, the marking of where fence posts would eventually go in spring. The kind of work that could be done incrementally, a few hours here and there, rather than the sustained push of the structural jobs. She should have felt settled by this. The house being finished meant the thing she'd been working toward was achieved. But instead, she felt something she hadn't anticipated, and it took her 3 days of circling it before she understood what it was. Fear. Not of the house. Not of Gideon. Fear of what came after the house was finished, because the whole shape of her time here had been organized around the house, around the practical, daily, side-by-side work of building it. That work had given her and Gideon a language with each other, a way of being in the same space that didn't require either of them to say anything too direct about what they were becoming. The house had been the thing between them that made everything else possible. When it was finished, she would have to figure out what she was doing here that wasn't contingent on the construction. She was thinking about this, sitting on the porch she'd helped build, wrapped in her coat, watching the snow-covered prairie go pale in the afternoon light, when she heard Gideon's boots behind her. He sat down on the step beside her, not too close. He had his own coffee. He looked out at the same view she was looking at. "Something wrong with the porch boards?" he said, which was his version of asking what she was thinking about. "I'm just sitting," she said. He drank his coffee, waited. "The house is almost done," she said. "Yes," he said. "What happens after that?" she asked. He turned to look at her. "What do you mean?" She kept her eyes on the prairie. "I mean, the arrangement, what we talked about in your letters, what we said in the beginning about figuring out if this was workable." She paused. "We haven't talked about that lately. I don't know where we are." He was quiet for long enough that she began to feel she'd made a mistake bringing it up. Then he said, "I thought it was working." "It is," she said. "That's not what I'm asking what it's working toward." "What do you want it to be working toward?" he said, not deflecting, asking, genuinely. She turned and looked at him. He was watching her with that careful, complete attention. "I want to stay," she said. "I want this to be real, not an arrangement. I want to know that I'm not just here until the house is done, and then we have a conversation about what comes next." Her voice stayed level, which cost something. "But I need to know that's what you want too. I'm not built for ambiguity anymore. I've lived in too much of it." He was quiet again. He turned his coffee cup in his hands, looking at it. "I asked you to come here," he said slowly, "because I thought I needed someone to help me build a life. And I was practical about it, the way I'm practical about most things. I made it into a transaction in my head." He paused. "You're not a transaction." "No," she said. "I'm not. I don't want you to leave," he said. It came out plain and direct and without decoration, in the way of a man who had decided to say the thing and was saying it. "That's not ambiguous. I don't want you to leave, and I'm aware that I haven't said things I should have said, and that's my failing, not yours." She looked at him. He was looking at her now. "I'm not easy," he said. "I know that," she said. "I've been alone long enough that I don't know how to—" He stopped. Tried again. "I don't always know how to show things in ways that other people can see." "I can see them," she said. He looked at her for a moment longer, then he looked back at the prairie. "Then you know," he said. It was not a declaration. It was not a proposal. It was a man telling her in the way he knew how that she was not temporary, and it was enough. More than enough. She looked out at the snow and the pale sky and the enormous flat nothing of the plains that had begun, somewhere in the last 2 months, to feel like something other than nothing. "Teach me," she said. He turned. "The trade," she said. "Teach me properly, not just holding boards and handing tools, the actual work, measuring, cutting, framing. I want to know how to do it." He looked at her for a long moment. "Why?" he said. "Because you're going to have more work next year than one person can do," she said. "Because I'm good with my hands and I learn fast and you know it. Because—" She stopped, chose the real reason. "Because I don't want to be someone who lives in a house you built. I want to be someone who helped build it, who can build the next one, who is useful to you in a way that isn't just cooking and mending." She met his eyes. "I want to be your partner in this, not your housekeeper." The word partner sat in the cold air between them. "Partner," he said. "If that's something you'd consider," she said. He looked at her for a long time, long enough that she could see him thinking, actually thinking, weighing it, not dismissing it, not looking for the polite way to tell her it wasn't how things were done. She'd been around him long enough to know the difference between the face he made when he was considering something and the face he made when he'd already decided. This was the considering face. "It's not easy work," he said. "You know that." "You've said that before," she said. "About all of it. It hasn't been easy. I'm still here." He turned and looked out at the prairie again, and she waited. "All right," he said. She exhaled. "All right. Starting after the new year," he said. "We finish the small jobs on the house. Then I'll teach you properly. Not just assisting, the actual work." He paused. "You'll make mistakes. I'll need you to not be defensive about being corrected." "I'm not defensive about being corrected," she said. "Everyone is at first," he said, "when the thing doesn't go the way you expected and someone tells you why." "Then I'll work on it," she said. He looked at her. That almost smile, the brief one, the rusty one that she'd come to understand meant more than an easier man's full grin. "You'll work on it," he said, as if it was obvious, as if there had never been any doubt that she would. The door to the house was behind them, solid on the hinges he'd set in September. The porch boards were firm underfoot, the joints tight against the winter. Somewhere in the root cellar were shelves she'd filled with preserved food, and in the kitchen was the range she'd cooked on every morning for 2 months, and in the back of the house was a bedroom with floors she'd helped lay and a window she'd helped glaze and trim. She'd watched him tear out and redo until it was right. She had arrived in Harlow with a worn suitcase and a 4-month-old letter, and the desperate hope that something she couldn't name was waiting at the end of the rail line. She did not know yet what exactly this was becoming, her and Gideon and this house on the Nebraska plain. She did not know what the spring would bring, or what she'd look like with a full set of carpentry skills, or what words they would eventually find for what they were to each other. But she was not temporary. He had said so, in the way he said things, and she had heard it, in the way she heard him, and that was settled now in a way that the cold and the snow and the great indifferent prairie could not undo. On the step beside her, Gideon finished his coffee and looked out at the white land. "Wind's picking up again," he said. "Yes," she said. "We should go in," he said. "In a minute," she said. He didn't argue. He sat beside her in the cold, and the two of them looked out together at the country that had no end to it, and the light fell across the snow in long blue shadows, and the house behind them held its ground against the wind the way it was built to. The new year came quietly, the way most things came to the prairie, without announcement, without ceremony, just a date turning over in the almanac while the wind did what it always did and the snow lay where it had been lying for weeks. Evelyn marked it by staying up past midnight for the first time since she'd arrived, sitting near the fire with a book she wasn't really reading, listening to the house settle in the cold. Gideon had gone to bed at his usual hour. He did not observe New Year's Eve in any particular way, which she'd expected. She hadn't asked him to. But at some point past 11 he appeared in the doorway in his work clothes. He slept in his work clothes on cold nights, which was practical and also faintly endearing, and looked at her with the expression of a man who had woken up and found the lamp still lit and come to see about it. "You're still up," he said. "Observing the occasion," she said. He looked at the window, which showed nothing but dark and the reflection of the room. "The occasion," he said. "New Year," she said. "New start." He was quiet for a moment. Then he came and sat in the chair across from her, not right away, but after a pause, like a man deciding to do something he hadn't planned on doing. He didn't say anything. She didn't require him to. They sat in the firelight until the clock on the shelf passed midnight without fanfare, and then Evelyn looked at him and said, "There it is." "There it is," he agreed. In the morning he began teaching her properly, the way he'd promised. He started with measuring, because he said everything else depended on it. A cut you couldn't undo, a nail you couldn't pull without damage, those things you could sometimes work around. A bad measurement compounded itself. It became the wrong angle, and the gap that wouldn't close and the joint that didn't fit, and by the time you found the mistake, it had cost you 3 more. "Measure twice," she said. "I've heard that. Measure twice and then look at it a 3rd time before you cut," he said. "Not because you can't be trusted, because the eye plays tricks when you want something to be right." She measured. She looked. She cut. The first board she cut on her own was a 1/4 inch short, which ruined it for what they needed. She knew it before he said anything. She could see it the moment she held it up to the gap. Again, he said without inflection. She got a new board. Measured. Looked a third time the way he'd said. Cut. This one was right, and she could tell before she held it up, could feel the rightness of it in the way the saw had moved. She held it up anyway. It fit. Good, he said. He was not effusive. He was not the kind of teacher who told you that you were doing wonderfully, because he wasn't the kind of man who said things he didn't mean. But he was patient in the specific way that mattered. He explained things once, clearly, and then let her try. And when she failed, he didn't show exasperation. He just showed her where the failure was and sent her back to try again. He expected her to get it eventually, which she understood was its own form of respect. She made mistakes. She expected to. What she hadn't expected was how much the mistakes would bother her. Not because he made them feel bad, but because she could see the right version, and the gap between where she was and where she needed to be was real and measurable. She'd been competent at things for so long that incompetence, even temporary incompetence, sat badly. "You're rushing the cuts," he said on the 4th day. "When you rush, you torque the saw." "I know," she said through her teeth. "You don't need to be fast yet," he said. "Fast comes after right." "I understand that," she said. "Then stop rushing." She put the saw down. She looked at him. He looked back, calm and unhurried. "I'm aware that I'm frustrated," she said. "I'm not frustrated with you." "I know," he said. "I'm frustrated with the saw," she said. "The saw is doing exactly what you're telling it to," he said. She picked the saw back up. He was right, and she knew it, and the knowing was part of what was frustrating. She slowed down. The next cut was cleaner. Not perfect, but materially better. She didn't say anything. Neither did he. But he moved to the next board and held it in position for her, which meant they were moving forward, which was acknowledgement enough. January was brutal, and February was worse. And by March she had developed genuine competence with the handsaw and a growing facility with the framing square, and could read a simple floor plan well enough to understand not just what went where, but why. Why the joists ran in that direction, why that wall carried load and this one didn't, why the window placement on the east face was 3 feet from the corner rather than 2. Gideon taught the way he built, the logic of the thing, not just the steps. "You need to understand what you're doing," he said once, when she'd asked why a particular joist had to be doubled at the header. "Not just how to do it. If you only know the steps, you can't solve problems you haven't seen before." "My father used to say something like that," she said, "about sewing. Said I needed to understand how cloth moved, not just how to run a seam." "Smart man," Gideon said. "He had his moments," she said, and left it at that. The town noticed the change before she did. She'd been so focused on the work itself, on the daily accumulation of skill and knowledge, that she hadn't been paying close attention to how Harlow was reading the situation. It was Clara Osgood who told her, on one of her increasingly regular visits, that the conversation about Evelyn had shifted. "When you first came," Clara said, warming her hands around her coffee cup, "people assumed you'd be gone by Christmas. A woman from somewhere else, coming on a matrimonial arrangement. It's a story people have seen before. It doesn't always end well." "It doesn't always end poorly either," Evelyn said. "No," Clara agreed. "But people bet on the odds they know." She paused. "Then you stayed through the storm. You worked on the house, and now you're out there building things alongside him. And Frank Mercer told my husband he saw you cutting lumber last week with a level in your back pocket like you'd been doing it for years." "I've been doing it for about 3 months," Evelyn said, "which is not years." "Not To Frank Mercer, it looked like years," Clara said. "That's the point. People are revising." "Revising what?" "Their idea of you," Clara said. "What you are here. Whether you're—" She chose the word carefully. "Permanent." Evelyn turned her coffee cup. "What do you think?" she asked. "Since you seem to be the one people tell things to." Clara looked at her with those sharp, honest eyes. "I think you're the best thing that's happened to Gideon Pike since he came to this town," she said. "And I think Harlow is starting to figure that out, even the ones who took the longest to look." It was the most direct thing Clara had said to her, and Evelyn found she had to look away from it for a moment. "The widow Pierce," she said. "You mentioned she had opinions. Clara made a sound that was not quite a laugh. "She'll come around," she said. She came around on the Brody family when they arrived, and she told everyone they'd be gone before their first winter. That was 4 years ago. The Reardon livery job materialized in March, just as Gideon had predicted it would. Reardon himself came out to the homestead on a Saturday, hat in hand in the literal sense, a red-faced man of 50 who walked through the structure in that particular way men walked through structures they were ashamed of. Fast, not looking directly at the worst parts. "Roof's bad," he said. "Your east wall is worse," Gideon said. Reardon looked at the east wall. He couldn't argue with it. "What would it take?" Gideon glanced at Evelyn. Just briefly, just a look that meant, "Here's the conversation I've been thinking about." And then he talked through the drawings he'd made in December during the storm. Full rebuild of the east wall, new roof structure, better drainage on the south side. He had numbers prepared. Reardon winced at the numbers, but not enough to walk away, because even Reardon could see that walking away meant a collapsed livery sometime next winter, and that would cost him more than the repair. When Reardon left with a handshake and a starting date of early April, Gideon stood for a moment in the yard and then turned and looked at Evelyn. "That's a 3-month job," he said. "Maybe 4. "I know," she said. "I saw the drawings." "I can't do it alone and run this place," he said. "I'd need to hire someone." She looked at him. He was looking at her with the careful expression, the one that she now understood meant he was approaching something he wasn't entirely sure how to say. "Or," she said. "Or," he said. They stood in the yard, in the March wind that still had winter in it, looking at each other. "How much of it can I actually do?" she asked. "Not in theory, practically." "The framing," he said. "A lot of the framing you could do. The roof work I'd want to be there for. It's dangerous if you don't know what you're doing at height. But the wall work, the floor repair in the stalls..." He paused. "You're better than you think you are." "Or I'm exactly as good as I think I am," she said, "and you've had low expectations." Something shifted in his face. "No," he said quietly. "I don't have low expectations of you. I've never had low expectations of you." She looked at him for a moment. "Then say yes," she said. He did. The Reardon livery job began on the second Monday of April, when the ground was soft enough to work, but the mornings were still cold enough that you could see your breath. Evelyn came to the job site with Gideon every morning, and if Reardon had feelings about a woman doing structural work on his building, he managed to keep them at a low simmer rather than a boil, which was the best she'd asked for. The first week was the east wall demolition and assessment, which was dirty, physical work, pulling down rotted lumber, sorting what could be saved from what couldn't, clearing the site. She was not afraid of dirty work. She never had been. But it was in the second week, when they began framing the new east wall, that the job became something else. Gideon was working the upper section of the frame, the top plate, the rafter tails. And she was below working the sole plate and the first studs, measuring and cutting and setting each piece according to the layout he'd marked in the morning. She had done this kind of work before, in the training of the last 3 months, but those had been smaller jobs, practice jobs. This was a real structure for a paying customer. This counted. The first day of framing, she set 11 studs. Gideon checked them at the end of the day. Level, plumb, nailed. He didn't say anything, which by now she had learned to read correctly. He moved on. The second day, she set 14 and her hand stopped hurting at the nailing. On the third day, old Cal Brody, the Brody from north of the homestead, a big man of 60 who had driven into town for supplies and stopped to watch out of the uncomplicated curiosity of a man who watched most things, leaned on the fence at the edge of the site and observed her work for a few minutes and then called over to Gideon. "She's good." Gideon, on the upper frame, didn't look down. "I know," he said. Brody looked at Evelyn. She kept working. She was aware of the compliment and was choosing to treat it like information rather than a gift, because if she stopped every time someone decided to be surprised by her, she'd never get anything finished. "Where'd you learn?" Brody called to her. She drove a nail and then looked over at him. "Right here," she said. "From him." Brody looked up at Gideon, then back at her. Then he nodded once with the gravity of a man filing something away and moved along. The weeks on the livery job had their difficulties. There was a Thursday in late April when a board she'd cut wrong had to be replaced, and she was short on the right material and had to make a second trip to the supply wagon, and it cost them 2 hours, and she was so angry with herself by the time she got back that she was nearly silent for the rest of the day. Gideon did not comment on the silence. He gave her space to work through it the way he always gave her space to work through things, and by the end of the afternoon she had made up the lost time and found her way back to herself. There was a week in May when the weather turned again, cold and wet, and working outdoors was miserable in a way she hadn't quite prepared for. Not dangerous, not impossible, just the particular grinding misery of wet boots and cold hands and lumber that was swelling in the rain. She and Gideon worked through it. They developed a way of setting up oilcloth shelters over the critical sections while they worked, which was his idea and her execution, and somewhere between the two of them they kept the job moving. There was an afternoon when Reardon brought his son to the site, a young man of maybe 17, who looked at Evelyn with the blank-faced bewilderment of someone seeing something he genuinely had no category for. Reardon himself said nothing, but she could see him watching her work and doing the arithmetic of what he was getting for his money. At the end of that day, Reardon caught Gideon at the tools. "She's actually building it," he said. Not an accusation, more like a man confirming his own observation. "That's right," Gideon said. "I thought she was—" Reardon searched for the word. "Assisting." "She's building the east wall," Gideon said. "I'm doing the roof and the upper structure. She's doing the wall." Reardon looked at the wall. It was straight and solid and progressing. He rubbed the back of his neck. "Well," he said. "The work's good," Gideon said. "That's what you're paying for." Reardon looked at the wall again. "Yes," he said after a moment. "I suppose it is." He walked back toward the livery. Gideon picked up his tools and came to stand beside Evelyn, who had heard the conversation from 12 feet away and had kept working through all of it. "Well," she said. "Well," he agreed. "He'll tell people," she said. "He already is," Gideon said. She looked at the wall she'd been building. It was straight. She checked it with the level she now carried in her back pocket the way Frank Mercer had noticed. Straight. "Good," she said. The Widow Pierce came around in June, as Clara had predicted, though it didn't look like coming around at first. She arrived at the job site on a Wednesday morning, a narrow woman in her 60s with a sharp face and the deliberate posture of someone who had decided early in life that her opinions were worth presenting well, and stood at the fence and watched for a while without saying anything. Evelyn was aware of her. She'd known who the Widow Pierce was since her second week in Harlow and had been waiting for this particular encounter the way you wait for weather you can see coming from a distance. Eventually the widow said, "Miss Hartwell." Evelyn set down what she was doing and walked over. "Mrs. Pierce," she said. The widow looked at her hands, which were calloused and marked with small scars from months of work, then at her face. "You're going to marry him," Mrs. Pierce said. Not a question. "That's between Gideon and me," Evelyn said. "In this town, everything is everyone's business eventually," the widow said. "I'm not saying that to be unpleasant. It's just the nature of a small place." She paused. "I told Clara Osgood when you came that you wouldn't last." "I remember," Evelyn said. "Clara told me." The widow had the grace to look slightly uncomfortable. "I was wrong," she said, with the precision of someone who'd practiced saying it and not much liked it. "Thank you," Evelyn said. "I'm not certain it's the natural order of things," the widow said, with a look at the wall. "A woman doing this kind of work." "I'm not certain there is a natural order," Evelyn said. "I think there's just work that needs doing and people who can do it." Mrs. Pierce looked at her for a long moment. The sharp face was unreadable. "My husband built the first house on our claim himself," the widow said finally. "I handed him every board for 3 weeks because his brother was laid up with a broken wrist. I never thought to call that natural or unnatural. It was just what needed doing." She straightened her already straight posture. "I'll see you at the summer social, I expect." "You will," Evelyn said. The widow nodded once, turned, and walked back toward the main street with the bearing of a woman who had said exactly as much as she intended to say. Evelyn stood at the fence for a moment. Then she heard Gideon behind her. He'd come down from the upper frame during the exchange, and she turned. "How much of that did you hear?" she asked. "Most of it," he said. She looked at the widow's retreating figure. Was that an apology? From Dorothea Pierce, he said. That was a full apology and a treaty of peace. Something in her chest eased. She picked up her tools. Back to work, she said. He went back to the upper frame. She went back to the wall. The sun was high and the Nebraska summer was warm on her shoulders, and the east wall of Reardon's livery was straight and solid and nearly done. And in the town behind her she could feel something that had been held in suspension beginning slowly to settle. She was not a temporary person anymore. She had not been for some time, really, but now Harlow was catching up to what she'd already understood, and that was its own kind of completion. Different from the floor and the windows and the trim that fit right, but no less real and no less earned. The Reardon livery finished on a Friday in late June, 2 days ahead of the estimate Gideon had given in March. This was not an accident. Evelyn had pushed the wall framing through a stretch in May when the weather made everything harder and it would have been reasonable to fall behind, and the 2 days they saved then were the 2 days that made the difference at the end. Reardon walked through the completed building with the particular expression of a man who had expected less than he received, not ungrateful, just surprised by the quality of his own good fortune. He ran his hand along the east wall. The wall Evelyn had built. He knocked on a stud with his knuckle the way men knocked on things to confirm they were solid, as if the sound would tell him something he couldn't see. Good wall, he said. Yes, Gideon said. Reardon looked at Evelyn. He was a plain man and not given to speeches. Good wall, he said again, to her this time, with a nod that meant more than the words. Thank you, she said. He paid them in full that afternoon, in the land office with Osgood as witness, and he shook both their hands. When he shook Evelyn's, he did it the same way he shook Gideon's, firmly, without the slight tentativeness some men showed when they weren't sure how to do it with a woman. And she noticed and appreciated it without saying so. They drove home in the early evening, the wagon moving easy over the summer road, the prairie gold on both sides in the long light. The horses were unhurried. Evelyn had her hands loose in her lap and her hat off, and the wind off the grass was warm for once, carrying the smell of something flowering she didn't have a name for. We finished early, she said. We did, he said. The wall section was the variable, she said. If that had gone slower, It didn't, he said. I know. I want to understand what made the difference. For next time. He glanced at her sideways. The blocking, he said. You started pre-cutting the blocking pieces in the mornings while I was setting up on the roof. That saved time I didn't account for. You noticed that, she said. I notice most things, he said, which was true, and which she'd known for a long time. She looked out at the prairie. A meadowlark crossed the road ahead of them, low and fast. She watched it go. Gideon, she said. What comes next? He was quiet in the considering way, not the evasive way. She knew the difference by now. There are 2 jobs I've been thinking about, he said. One is the Hallett widow. She needs her outbuilding rebuilt from the foundation. It's small, 2 weeks maybe. The other is bigger. How much bigger? Town council came to me last month, he said. While you were working the wall one afternoon, I didn't say anything because I wanted to think about it first. She turned to look at him. He was watching the road. The schoolhouse, he said. Harlow's been talking about a proper schoolhouse for 2 years. They have the land allocated and they've got some funds set aside and they need someone to build it. He paused. It's a 4-month job at minimum, maybe 5. Real foundation, not just post and pier. Multi-room. They want it done before next winter so they can open in the spring. She was quiet for a moment. The wagon rolled on. That's a significant job, she said. It's the biggest job I've ever been offered in Harlow, he said. Can we do it? She asked. Not can you. We. She didn't think about it before she said it, which meant it was the right word. He didn't react to it outwardly, but she felt the slight shift in the air beside her. I think so, he said. With both of us, I think we can do it on schedule. A pause. I need you to understand what that means, though. It's not the livery. It's bigger and more complicated, and it'll have people watching every day because it's a public building and people have opinions about public buildings. People have had opinions about everything I've done since I got off that train, she said. I know, he said. I just want you to know that this will be more of it. She looked at his profile. He was serious, not doubtful. There was a difference. He wasn't questioning whether she could handle it. He was making sure she knew what she was walking into. "Tell me you want to do it," she said. He looked at her then. "I want to do it," he said. "Then we do it," she said. He turned back to the road. The homestead was visible ahead now, the house low and solid on the flat, the porch she'd helped build casting a late shadow eastward across the yard. The kitchen garden she'd planted in April was green and serious along the south fence. The chicken coop with its proper ventilation held 4 hens and a rooster named, by Gideon, nothing, because he still maintained he wasn't naming chickens. She had stopped pointing out that he already had. They had supper that evening on the porch, which they did in summer when the weather allowed. Because the porch faced west and the sunsets over the Nebraska plain were, she had come to understand, one of the genuine extravagances of this place. The sky going pink and orange, and a deep red that had nothing restrained about it, color poured out like someone had decided to be generous. She didn't say this to Gideon because it sounded like the kind of thing she would have said when she first arrived, when she was still seeing the prairie as a stranger saw it. She just sat with her plate and her coffee and watched the sky do what it did. "I want to say something," Gideon said. She looked at him. He was looking at his coffee cup, not at her, which meant it was something that required a little cover. "All right," she said. "When you came here," he said, I told you before that I'd expected to be disappointed. That's true. But the other thing, the thing I didn't say, is that I had already decided before you arrived that I would be fair to you regardless of what happened, that I would not make you feel unwelcome if it didn't work, because you'd come a long way and you deserved basic fairness." She watched him. "What I didn't account for," he said, still to the cup, "is that fairness has nothing to do with what this became." The sky was going deeper red. Somewhere out in the grass, something was making an evening sound, a low, sustained thing. "No," she said quietly. "It doesn't." He looked up then. His eyes in the evening light were dark and direct, and she'd learned to read what was in them even when his face gave very little away. "I don't know how to say most of what I mean," he said. "You know that." "I know that," she said, "but I want you to know that I—" He stopped. Tried again. "You're not what I expected, and I mean that as the best possible thing I know how to say." She looked at him for a long moment. "I know," she said. "I know what you mean." He nodded, went back to his coffee. She went back to the sunset. The moment settled into the evening around them and became part of it, neither of them needing to do anything more with it, because they were both people who understood that some things didn't need more words than they'd already been given. The next morning she drove into Harlow alone to pick up a seed order she'd placed 3 weeks ago and to go to the post office, where there were 2 letters waiting. One for Gideon from his mother in Ohio, thin and short in the way his mother's letters always were, and one for Evelyn from a woman she'd worked with in Kansas City, which surprised her because she hadn't heard from that quarter in 2 years. She read her letter at the post office counter while the postmaster pretended not to watch. Her friend in Kansas City had married, was living in St. Louis now. Wrote to say she'd thought of Evelyn recently and wondered how she was and hoped the Nebraska venture had worked out. The last word carrying the faint skepticism of someone who had heard the plan at the time and had doubts. Evelyn thought about how to answer that. The Nebraska venture. She looked around at the post office with its familiar smell of paper and ink and the particular way the morning light came through the single window. She knew the postmaster's name. She knew which days the supply wagon came from Kearney. She knew where the ice on the road to the homestead hid in winter. She knew her way home without thinking about the turns. She wrote back that afternoon at the kitchen table, a letter that was honest and not boastful. She didn't boast. It wasn't in her, but that said plainly that she had found work that mattered and a person worth staying for and a place she intended to remain. She sealed it, and she felt, in the sealing, something finalized that had been in the process of finalizing for a long time. She put the letter on the stack for the next mail day and went back to what she was doing. The town social happened in mid-July, in the field behind the land office where they'd been holding the summer social for as long as anyone remembered. Tables set out, food brought from every household, the kind of gathered abundance that small communities produce when they decide to be generous with each other. Evelyn went with Gideon, who wore his better shirt and his cleaned hat and looked exactly like a man who was attending something because it was expected and intended to behave acceptably until he could reasonably go home. She wore the blue dress she'd made herself in the spring from fabric she'd ordered from Kearney, which was not grand by anyone's measure, but was well made and fit correctly, which she valued over grandeur. Clara Osgood found her within 5 minutes and walked her around the gathered town in the frank and efficient way of a woman who understood that the best way to handle a room was to move through it purposefully. People were different with her than they had been at Christmas. The difference was not dramatic. Harlow was not a dramatic town, but it was real. Mrs. Brodie asked her about the kitchen garden and what she'd planted and whether she'd had trouble with the dry spell in June. 2 of the men who'd worked occasional labor for Gideon stopped her to ask about the schoolhouse project, which had apparently traveled through town faster than she'd expected. Young Frank Mercer, 19 and recently trying to grow a beard with mixed results, asked her seriously if she thought there'd be work for him on the schoolhouse build. "Talk to Gideon," she said. "He makes those decisions." "I figured you'd know," Mercer said. "You're building it with him." "We're building it together," she said. "But he's the lead. Ask him." Mercer nodded and went to find Gideon, and Evelyn stood for a moment with her plate of food watching the social happen around her. The children running, the older men talking in their careful standing circles, the women moving back and forth between tables with the efficient sociality of people who kept communities running. She had been on the outside of scenes like this for a long time, passing through, present but not of the place. She was of this place now. That was not a small thing. The Widow Pierce materialized at her elbow with a plate of something involving beets, which Evelyn disliked but accepted because refusing food from the Widow Pierce at a social seemed inadvisable. "I hear you're doing the schoolhouse," Mrs. Pierce said. "We are," Evelyn said. "How long?" 4 months, maybe 5 if the fall weather turns early." The widow ate a bite of something. "My late husband helped build the first version of the meeting hall," she said. 1871. It burned in 76, which is a separate story, but I remember what the town looked like when it went up. She paused. "There's something about watching a building come out of the ground. Feels like the place is deciding to be real." Evelyn looked at her. The sharp face was softer in the summer evening light. "Yes," she said. "That's exactly what it feels like." The widow ate another bite. "The beets are from my garden," she said. "I put dill in the pickling this year. See if you notice the difference." Evelyn took a bite of beets. They were, she had to admit, very good. "I notice," she said. Something at the corner of Mrs. Pierce's mouth moved upward. It was not a large movement, but it was genuine, and it was the closest thing to warmth the widow had ever directed at her. They ate beets together in the summer evening and didn't need to say anything more. The schoolhouse groundbreaking happened on the 1st of August. Gideon had spent the weeks between the social and the start date on materials, ordering the lumber, arranging delivery, calculating what they'd need, and in what sequence. Evelyn had helped with the calculations, spreading the plans across the kitchen table after supper and working through the material list with him, checking his numbers and occasionally catching a quantity that needed adjustment. She was not infallible at this. Neither was he. Together they caught more than either would have caught alone, which was the point of 2 people. Frank Mercer got his job on the schoolhouse. He was young and not particularly skilled, but he was strong and willing to learn, and Gideon was patient enough to teach him the basic work, which freed Evelyn and Gideon to handle the more complex framing and structural work. The 3 of them settled into a rhythm within a week, and it was not always a smooth rhythm. Mercer was occasionally careless and had to be redirected, and there was a Friday when a delivery of lumber was wrong dimensioned and had to go back, which cost them 2 days and a great deal of Gideon's carefully managed patience. But the rhythm held. She thought about things, in the long physical hours of the work, that she hadn't had much space to think about when she was still new to all of it, and every task required her full concentration. She thought about the version of herself who had answered that advertisement on a rainy Tuesday in Kansas City, sitting in a boarding house she was about to leave, reading a man's plain words with no promises in them, and deciding that plain and honest was what she'd been missing. She had not known then what she was looking for. She'd known what she was running from, the rootlessness, the sense of herself as a woman in motion with no destination. She'd thought vaguely that what she wanted was safety, a settled life, somewhere to stop. What she'd found was not safety exactly. The prairie didn't do safety. It was too large and too indifferent and too ready to remind you that your plans meant very little to it. What she'd found was something harder to name and more durable than safety. She had found work that asked everything of her. She had found a person who expected her to be capable and was not surprised when she was. She had found the difference between being somewhere and being of somewhere, between occupying a life and building one. The distinction mattered. She understood that now in a way she couldn't have articulated when she stepped off the train a year ago with her worn suitcase and her 4-month-old letter. You could move through the world your whole life and mistake motion for progress. She had done it for 8 years, moving from city to city, job to job, arrangement to arrangement, always telling herself that the next place would be different, that she was going somewhere even when she couldn't say where. The motion had felt like agency. It had not been. Building something was different. Building something meant choosing to stay in a place long enough for your work to outlast the day. It meant caring about whether the joint was right, whether the floor would hold, whether the wall would stand in 30 years when neither of you was here to see it. That kind of caring was not possible in motion. It required roots, and roots required the decision to stop moving and accept the risk that this particular place might not be perfect, might be hard, might ask more than you wanted to give. She had made that decision, and the decision had made her. In September, with the schoolhouse frame complete and the roof going on, Gideon asked her to marry him. It was not an elaborate moment. They were at the end of a workday, Mercer had gone home, and they were walking back through the half-built schoolhouse in the evening quiet. She'd been checking the window framing on the east side, and he'd been on the far end doing something with the door header, and they met in the middle of the room, which would be the main classroom. The floor not yet laid, just the joists and the sub-floorboards she'd spent most of the day nailing down. He stopped in front of her. She stopped. He looked at her with that direct, complete attention. "I want to marry you," he said. "Not because of the arrangement we started with, because of who you are and what we've built, and because I don't want to be doing this." A slight gesture that encompassed, she understood, both the room around them and the larger thing. "With anyone but you." She looked at him. The evening light came through the unglazed window openings in long bars, laying across the new subfloor in gold strips, sawdust in the air, the smell of fresh lumber, which she had come to love with a specificity that would have surprised her former self. "That's the most you've said at one time," she said. The rusty, brief, real thing happened at the corner of his mouth. "I practiced," he said. She felt something give way in her chest, not painfully, more like a door that had been held closed by pressure finally opening. "Yes," she said. "Of course, yes." He reached into his shirt pocket and produced a ring, simple, plain silver, a band without ornament. And she understood he'd been carrying it there for some time, waiting for the right moment in the way he waited for anything, without rushing, without forcing it, until the moment was what it was supposed to be. He put it on her finger and it fit, which she suspected was not an accident. He'd been paying attention. He always had been. She looked at the ring on her hand, then at him. "The window glazing on the east side," she said. He blinked. "What about it?" "I'm going to need your help setting the panes," she said. "Tomorrow morning. The angles on the east-facing frames are tricky, and I don't want to crack a pane." He looked at her for a moment. "We just got engaged," he said. "I know," she said. "The glazing still needs doing." He held her gaze. Then the brief, real thing expanded into something more. Still not a broad grin, still recognizably Gideon, but genuine and full and belonging to this moment and this woman and this half-built room. "Tomorrow morning," he said. "We'll do the glazing." The schoolhouse was finished on the 14th of October, 3 weeks before the first real frost, and well inside the window the town council had asked for. The final day was a long one, she and Gideon and Mercer working through the last punch list, the things that seemed small, but that Gideon would not leave undone. The interior trim and the door hardware, and the 3 steps at the front entrance that had to be level or they'd be a hazard in winter ice. The steps took 2 tries. The second set was right. When the last task was done and the tools were packed, and Mercer had gone home with his week's pay and a handshake, Evelyn and Gideon stood outside the front entrance of the schoolhouse in the October afternoon and looked at what they'd made. It was a real building, solid foundation, true walls, good roof, windows that would hold against a Nebraska winter. A building that would be here in 20 years. In 40. long after the three of them who built it were gone from this particular stretch of plain. Harlow's children would learn to read in this building, would learn arithmetic, history, the names of distant places they'd spend their whole lives imagining. Some of them would leave this town and carry some residue of this building with them. The idea that the place they came from had invested in them, had built something for them, had decided they were worth the effort. She thought about that. The investment of a building. The statement a community makes when it puts good work into something that serves its own future. "It's good," she said. He was standing beside her with his hands in his pockets, looking at the building the way he always looked at finished things, not with satisfaction exactly, but with the assessment of a craftsman who knows the work is done and is taking one last reading before he lets it go. "It's good," he said. "The northeast corner," she said. "I know you're looking at it." "The trim is a hair off," he said. "A hair," she said. "I'll fix it before the opening," he said. "You will not," she said. "We're finished. The building is finished. The trim is within tolerance, and you know it." He looked at it. He looked at her. She held firm, which was something she'd learned to do with him. Not stubbornly, but from the solid ground of knowing when she was right. "Fine," he said. "Good," she said. He looked back at the schoolhouse. After a moment he said, "Osgood mentioned another job. A family buying the Daltrey claim, east of the Mercers. They want a house built before they move in. Good-sized family, apparently." "How big a house?" she asked. "Big enough," he said. 3 months, I think. Starting in spring." She looked at the schoolhouse, at the true walls and the level steps and the windows she'd helped glaze, and the door she'd watched Mercer hang under Gideon's instruction, correcting his mistakes twice before the third attempt was right. "Spring," she said. "That gives us the winter." "For what?" he said. "For getting married," she said, "and resting, and fixing whatever the winter finds wrong with our house." She looked at him. "And teaching me the foundation work. You've been putting that off." He raised an eyebrow. "I've been putting it off because it requires a ground that isn't frozen." "Then we'll do the theory now and the practice in spring," she said. "Before we start the Daltrey house, I want to understand the whole job, Gideon, not just framing, all of it." He looked at her for a moment. The light was going now, the October afternoon closing fast, the shadows out of the east coming long across the new-mown grass. "You're going to keep going," he said. Not a question, more like a man confirming something he'd already known. "I'm not built to stop," she said. "No," he said. "You're not." He said it the way he said things he meant, without ornament, as plain as the work they did. "Good." They walked to the wagon together. She picked up her tool bag and he picked up his, and they loaded them into the bed the way they always did. Organized, by function, the same arrangement every time because a system that worked was worth keeping. Agnes and Hal were patient at the hitch, ready to go home. Gideon checked the hitch. She checked that the tarp was secure over the tools. They climbed up, and he clicked to the horses, and the wagon moved out onto the road toward the homestead. The prairie stretched out on all sides in the late afternoon. Flat and enormous, and going gold in the autumn light, the grass moving in the wind the way it always moved, with the indifference of something that had been here long before any of them and would be here long after. She had stood in this landscape a year ago and felt small inside it. She still felt small inside it. That had not changed, and she did not think it ever would. But small was not the same as insignificant. A well-built wall was not large by comparison with the plain it stood on. It mattered anyway. It held the cold out. It kept the family inside warm. It stood for 20 years and then 40, and then longer, outlasting the hands that built it, going on doing its quiet, useful work in the world. That was enough, more than enough, if you understood what enough meant. She had a ring on her finger and calluses on her hands, and a level in her coat pocket, and a man beside her who had never once asked her to be less than she was. She was going to marry him in the winter and build a house with him in the spring and go on building things in this place that had decided to be hers. She had come to Harlow with nothing but a worn suitcase and a 4-month-old letter. She was leaving nothing behind her anymore. The wagon rolled on toward home through the gold October light, and the prairie went on in every direction as far as any eye could see, and the wind moved the grass, and somewhere behind them in the town a building stood that had not stood before, solid and true, built by imperfect hands that had learned what they knew through failure and patience and the willingness to tear out what was wrong and do it again until it was right. That was all a life required in the end. Not perfection, just the willingness to keep getting it closer.